Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Let's continue our hacking movie marathon. This month marks the 30th anniversary of Jurassic Park. It's an excellent reference for threat modeling. Imagine confidentiality with an insider selling trade secrets. Oh, Nedry. Integrity of controls on dinosaurs breeding. To quote Malcolm, life, finds a way. Availability in the electrified fence. Hello, velociraptors. But what rings most true is that the park's computer system has about 2 million lines of code, and if a code review was the only way to turn the safety systems back on, everyone would have died. Which means this week we chat with Eric Olden about the role of identity and how to bring modern identity management to legacy and modern applications. In the news segment, a new DBIR from Verizon, a new version coming for CVSS, an old API for password resets, vulns and appliances, an IAM CTF, and more. Spare no expense, and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the zero-noise application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Invicti, AppSec with zero noise. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. Struggling to secure all your applications with modern identity services? You're not alone. But with Identity Orchestration, you can say goodbye to refactoring and complexity. Strata Identity helps you modernize app identity at scale while mitigating security risks and simplifying policy management. Maintain a consistent security posture and simplify policy management with Identity Orchestration. If you're ready to simplify your identity environment and improve your app security, share your IAM challenge with the Strata team to get a brand new set of earbuds. Just visit securityweekly.com/strata to learn more. That's securityweekly.com/strata. This is episode 244, recorded June 13th, 2023. It's a Tuesday. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mike, how are you? I'm at the ready. I've got my EpiPen just in case I get a flare up from too much application security. So let's see what we can do.
All right, we've only got 30 minutes, but let's see if we can put John into a medical emergency. I'm not sure this is the right way to go. But while John gets things set up, you can join us at an upcoming official cybersecurity summit in the city near you. This series of one-day, invitation-only executive-level conferences are designed to educate senior cyber professionals on the latest threat landscape, like Jurassic Park. We're pleased to offer our listeners $100 off admission when you use code SECWEEK23 to register. Visit securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit to learn more and register today. This segment is sponsored by Strata. To learn more about them, visit securityweekly.com/strata. Eric Olden created the first single sign-on product for web applications, launched the first identity as a service company, and co-authored the SAML standard. He is currently CEO and co-founder of Strata Identity. Hello, Eric. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Glad to have you here because one of the things I just kind of wanted to start off with is that we're going to talk about identity management. Maybe we'll throw in a little bit of XML if we can tolerate such things from SAML. My apologies. But you've been around the identity environment for quite a long time, but I think you have worked on not so much as whiteboards as well as surfboards for a lot of your inspiration. So I thought that was just kind of a fun thing to kick us off with.
Yeah, there's a lot that, so I'm born and raised in Silicon Valley, one of the few people that can say that, but a lot of what I would do with my free time would be surfing in Santa Cruz and San Francisco and Pacifica and so forth. And I always found that getting out in the water and getting out in nature and doing something that you have to be totally focused on opens up new channels of thinking. And, it was a number of different times out in Pacifica surfing that my good friend Darren Platt and I were talking about what became the notion of federation. And on one particular day, it was really foggy, and we came back to my car, and the Subaru had all the kind of fog and stuff on the condensation on the window. And that was the very first time we drew out the 4-box model, which was the basis of the trust relationships inside of SAML. And so, and maybe not a lot of people understand that surfing actually had a lot to do with some of the fundamental concepts inside of federated identity. But have a lot of fun out there, and have continued to do it, even though I moved inland a bit. And surfing, surfing and identity, they continue to be a common theme in my life. And so it's been really surfing's taught me a whole lot, not only about life, but on how to be patient and wait for the right timing, and which are the waves to try and catch, and which are the ones that you need to wait for them to develop a bit more. And we parlayed that all the way through to starting this company, Strata, and my co-founders and I we were kind of coming back from a trip from Oracle, and we had a team in India. The short of it is that on the way back, we went through Sri Lanka, and it was in that surf trip that I was talking to my co-founders, and I said, hey, imagine a world where we would have a completely different approach to identity. We'd be able to orchestrate and abstract everything. And what do you guys think of that? And they thought about it for a while and said, I think that would be crazy, but if we can get it to work, that would really be a breakthrough. And so yet again, the second time where surfing became the inspiration, in this case here, for identity orchestration. So it's been very, very fun to do it at the same time. It's makes you think in a different way. So that's been a lot of fun.
I like that, and especially kudos for surfing in Northern California, because the water's not warm. It's pretty cold out there, and I think it's also, if you come, tying in identity orchestration, if you come to some legacy apps, especially saying we need to move to a different single SSO provider, you might be pouring cold water on that dev team. They're not going to appreciate that. So part of this is talking about let's hit on the importance of identity. I think maybe that's an easy question, but why is identity so important for apps right now and for users?
Yeah, well, a lot of things have happened over the lifespan of computing, and seeing how today the focus is on moving to the cloud, but it's not just one cloud, it's multiple clouds. And a lot of these things were accelerated, these trends were accelerated with COVID and remote work. Now, instead of having everybody in one place, you've got people working remotely, the applications are running everywhere, the data that power those applications also is everywhere. And so we couldn't rely on a notion of a perimeter to keep the bad guys out and the good things in. So in that zero trust world, the perimeter, as has been said before, the identity is now the new perimeter. And so the thing that you can control are your users, and through how they interact with the applications and data is really drawn a focus less on perimeters. They're still around, but less about a binary in or out and more about identity centric. And it's more nuanced because you have a lot of different identity constructs. You think about the authentication and access control, authorization, auditing, and I think I missed one in there, but either way, there's 5. And all of these disciplines now are coming to be implemented in this distributed multi-cloud world. So it's really the only way to manage access is through identity. And I think that's why it's so much the focus today.
I just want to check something real quick. Did I just hear you say that we can control our users?
The levers of control, I think, have to focus on the users. But you bring up a great point. People ask me and say, well, why do we still have all of these threats? And I said, well, the weak link is the user, and we can have all the best technology in the world, but someone drops a USB stick with the salaries.xls file on it. Everyone's curious, and next thing you know, you got malware, and you've undone a lot of investment on security because of human nature. So it's a qualified control the user, John, for sure.
I also want to qualify that too, because I think part of that is that, sure, humans perhaps have some weaknesses to them, but maybe a weak link there is also, oh, well, we didn't have MFA on this. We didn't have a YubiKey, or we didn't have a WebAuthn. So, we're going to top out the Verizon DBIR in our second segment. And spoiler, pretty much, compromised credentials, best way into a system. So if we, coming from an AppSec perspective, say, well, we are worried about the phishing, et cetera, and so on, and we want to layer on some strong MFA, some of the auditing as well that you were mentioning, Eric, that's, implementing that from scratch probably isn't the easiest thing. And I think this is where let's talk a little bit about what does either the orchestration or what are the easy ways to bring in this type of standard user experience for MFA, et cetera, regardless of what the app is, whether it was written 10 years ago or, 10 days ago.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, Mike. And I think a lot of times people underestimate how much work goes into integrating identity with an application, because once it's done, you don't think about it anymore. And so you kind of think about it like plumbing. It's important as you put it together, but once it's inside the wall, you hope you never have to deal with it. Well, over time, applications, they need to be modernized. And whether it's that you want to move them to the cloud to take advantage of cloud platforms, or you want to have some new capabilities on the identity side, passwordless being a really key thing today, then you're now forced to look at how that plumbing was all put together. And the classic way is to basically rewrite the application, take all the drywall off the wall, reroute the pipes from one place to the other, and it takes a long time, very expensive. And another way to think about it is to use an abstraction layer that would allow you to decouple the application from identity. And that's what identity orchestration does. And you can think about it as this abstraction layer that on one hand, on one side of the integration, it talks to the application in the same kind of way which the application already expects identity to come through. And so, for instance, that might be with a legacy application, something like a header or the HTTP cookies and things of that type. And the challenge is that on the other end of the integration, these identity providers, the IDPs, they're evolving and they're adopting new technologies and capabilities. And today they use standards like SAML, OpenID Connect, and some others. And so if you want to get a legacy application that uses HTTP headers to talk to IDP that's using OpenID Connect, historically that meant you'd have to rewrite the application so it no longer uses cookies and instead can consume OpenID Connect. With an abstraction layer that simultaneously presents a facade to the application of what it expects, in this example, a cookie or an HTTP header integration. But on the other end, where the IDP is involved, that can now go with the OpenID Connect or some modern standard. So that abstraction layer basically lets you, mix and match the IDPs without changing the applications. And where this becomes really important is if you have a lot of applications, and by a lot of applications, just more than one. Because if you just have one app, it might take you 6 months and a couple $100,000 to rewrite it. To some, that might be a huge amount of money, but to big enterprise, that's kind of a cost of doing business. Is when you've got 10, 20, 100, or thousands of applications, then the time alone will really slow you down. One of our customers is a big retailer. They have 200 applications that they wanted to upgrade the identity with. And they had been spending 6 months per application. And so you do the math, that's 100 years
luck.
of work. Nobody wants to do that. So you swap it out with software instead of manual effort. And that's how you can bring things like passwordless authentication to a legacy application without rewriting it and do it at scale.
Eric, you've got me reaching for the EpiPen. Please be careful. But seriously, I mean, that does sound like a nightmare. But so I'd love to dig down into this a little bit deeper because you've been in this space for a while. You've helped a ton of companies with this. I think about this from two different points of view. One is a startup guy, like when you're writing that application for the first time, just trying to see like does this pass the sniff test, which I'm having a hard time sniffing today. But the second one is in that large enterprise. So in either case, when you're originally started dreaming up these ideas, when the last thing on your mind is authentication or identification or any of these sort of aspects of the application, I've been guilty in the past. A co-founder at one of my startups wanted me to, he was very diligently trying to get me to think about enterprise authentication from the beginning and SAML and things like this. And I'm like, I'll do it that 6 months time once we get funding. So this is real, right? We all know that. But the second part is at another startup, we had bought into one of the cloud providers' ideas of like, here's your get up and go. Don't worry about all behind the scenes things. Just run this command. It'll set everything up for you. And after 6 months, I realized, oh my God, that authentication system is horrible. And then I still had to replace it. So in either case, I'd love to hear a little more. How do you, when you're talking to someone who is, how do you get in front of someone to think about this in the first place, right? In those first few months. But then B, how should they be thinking about making something easily flexible so that they can realize when they've either made a mistake or they've made a mistake that they need to go and change something? How do you talk to people like that?
Yeah, well, in the case of a greenfield where you have a brand new application that you're building, that's a very fortunate place to be. Sure. And I think a lot of times, myself included, that's wonderful. You're like, hey, I've got a clean whiteboard. I'm going to start to design a system that's really good. You need to, in startups, you need to move forward with imperfect information. And I like to paraphrase, I think it was Voltaire who said, don't make perfect the enemy of good. And so kind of incorporating this notion of rapid iteration and just kind of thinking to your point earlier, hey, we'll fix it later. I just want to get something working today. Believe it or not, I think that's the most important thing, is to be able to ship software and be thinking about security from the very beginning and knowing that, hey, if we are serious about the security and the trust of this application and this data, then we've got to have that designed in from the very beginning. But you don't need to have everything built out. And so I think the other piece of advice I would give, if you're building a brand new application, always use standards, because it's really when you don't implement standards that you're really tied into whatever proprietary system there is. Now, that said, when we were doing this in the early 2000s, like 20 plus years ago, the standard was HTTP, and you had headers, and that was just the way that it worked. And so everyone kind of made a similar implementation. Cookies were proprietary, but all the browsers supported it. So you had this quasi-standardization, but it was very limited. And so I think that's what led to the creation of things like SAML and subsequent things like OpenID Connect, is that choose a standard that has got a future. And as proud as I am about SAML, I would say that it's a lot easier to do OpenID Connect. And I think the amount of work that you need to do to put that in place is a whole lot less than what you had to do within the SAML days. So I think that would be a good place to start. And then the other way to think about standards is, how do you avoid lock-in? And think about that identity provider. And you're going to have more than one, because if, for instance, you build on one cloud and you want to be able to move to another cloud, let's say that you start with, you're a Microsoft development shop. And so you start with Azure and you get everything working. But then something comes up and you want to be on AWS. And in the case of Microsoft, you'll be using Azure Active Directory and all of its integration. And you want to be able to switch that to, say, Cognito. Well, the great thing about both of those identity providers is they both support OpenID Connect. And so it's more of a configuration that you can make a change and say, hey, I'm going to consume my identity from the new IDP instead of the old. If you do that in the beginning, it's a configuration change, not an application rewrite. So to net it out, think about standards, think about how you're going to handle future choices of flexibility, and don't try and solve everything all at once, because you're going to be building too much security and you may find a reason that you want to change something down the road. So starting with something good and making it better would be my advice.
Kind of riffing off of that, starting with something good, making it better. Obviously you were involved quite a bit with SAML. You're now, part of IDQL, kind of that effort, talking about standards, bringing in some standardization of policy. Tell us a little bit about IDQL, and especially if there are aspects of that, like lessons learned of trying to corral people together for a standard or create something that is, I'm going to tease and poke at XML a little bit more because I think it's kind of easy to do. But kind of what influences you 20 years later as you approach this?
Yeah, so great question. IDQL stands for Identity Query Language, and it is a new standard that's designed to solve the problem of heterogeneous or fragmented policy. So the rules, at the end of the day, that's what governs access. And the way that rules are embodied in application platforms, say, for instance, on Azure, those policies are very different than the policies that do the same thing, but run on Google Cloud. So you've got two different syntax, and you also have a challenge in that the only way to really understand them is to understand how those APIs work, because those policies are represented in an imperative way. So you infer them through the combination of API calls and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is you have to have a real deep understanding of the computing data model in order to understand the context of that policy. And so it gets really complicated. And we saw that was a limitation. Identity became a real point of lock-in, where people say, well, I can't move from one cloud to the other because I have to redo my policies. And at scale, this becomes a real challenge, because we're not talking one or two policies, but you could have hundreds or thousands of policies because they're being built programmatically. So at Strata, we talked to a lot of different organizations, and we said, is this a problem for you? Or do you want to have that portability to move your identities and your workloads from one place to the other? And they say, yeah, but that's impossible because we don't have enough time and we don't understand how the other one's set up. Our auditors get confused because they're trying to understand these two different worlds. So that led to the creation of this new standardized representation of policy. And in this case, we were able to learn from a lot of the stuff we did kind of the hard way in the SAML days. And so one of the main things is to make the policies declarative, human readable, as opposed to imperative. And so you can truly read an IDQL policy and you can read it out loud, and anyone listening to you would say, oh, I know what you're talking about. I understand. And as you know, with security, having confidence that you configured things correctly is very important, because if you thought you locked the door, but in fact you unlocked it, you're blissfully walking off to wherever you are and you left the front door unlocked. And it's worse because you think that it's locked. And so you may act differently because of that, a false sense of confidence and security. So we wanted to make the policies really human readable, and so we settled on declarative. And then the second thing that we learned was with SAML, it took probably a good 10, 12 years for SAML to reach widespread adoption. And the reason for that was that we had to have all of the product managers of the identity providers and the applications and the SaaS platforms all think that this is a good idea, prioritize it in their backlog, and implement that feature in their software. So about almost a decade lost, where SAML was worked from day one, but it was really hard to implement. And you're right, the XML stuff is easy to poke at, but circa 1999, 2000, that was the best that you had.
Everything was
So
XML. Absolutely.
we did what we could with what we had. But fast forward, now we're trying to solve this problem of distributed policies. And now you've got the same issue where, well, what do we do with all of the product managers? How do we convince them to do this? And there actually may be people who don't want to do it for various reasons. So what we did is we implemented this in open source, and we put a open source free implementation of IDQL in the form of Hexa. And that's on the Cloud Native Computing Foundation projects next to Kubernetes and OPA, which are really, we see the kind of the way to do native identity in distributed world. So we gave away the software so people didn't have to build it. And so they could just use it for free, and it works with all the clouds today. So we took that 10, 12-year period and collapsed it to nothing. So the benefit to everybody is it's ready to go right now. You don't have to wait for the cloud providers to build it because it's already working with all the clouds, and it's solving that problem of consistency of policy on all your clouds and through your stack.
Yeah, and I like, as a fan of things like Terraform, infrastructure as code, seeing a policy as code, I think, as you said, is human readable, which is already very friendly. But if it's also that predictable, declarative, I imagine can be linted. We can reason more about it to find out, as you said, here is the door that's been left open, aka the S3 bucket that's sitting out there that's leading to a "we take your security seriously" statement anytime soon. Curious here, originally too, I was talking about just layering on MFA, getting something more than just a username and password for these identity providers. I'm curious too, have you seen also even a maturation when teams can take this and worry less about here are the implementation details for this very specific provider and talk about like, well, do we want RBAC? Do we want ABAC? Things that are perhaps even more, and I'm trying to avoid zero trust to the word, but the idea of principles of having more attributes, just decide this, you should be authenticated here or also pulling in a little bit of authorization, I suppose, in this aspect too. But I'm just curious if you've seen that, how you've seen that mature amongst teams.
Yeah, absolutely. We do see it across the board where people are trying to figure out how to implement zero trust, for better or for worse, right? And I understand why people shy from it because somebody came up with a notion and put it out there, it caught people's attention, and then very quickly everyone's using it in the wrong context and like treating zero trust like it was a product. And I think the way that we see it anyways is it's a notion, and it's a set of principles and a way to think about how you can achieve a highest level of confidence and trust. And it brings together certain concepts like least privilege and continuous authentication and continuous access control. So we have seen it evolve in as a concept to include some really powerful things like the Continuous Access Enforcement Protocol, CAPE, for instance. And what CAPE does is think about every time that you're going to run an application, access the application at all, or run a function within an application, or do something within that, you want to make sure that the person who's trying to do that has the authorization to do that, number one. Number two, maybe in the other order, but the other thing that you need to do is make sure you're dealing with the right person and that they're authentic. And so you have to think about how to authenticate them. And so once you have authentication, then you can think about authorization, and you want to be able to create an audit log of all this activity. And so access control fits into that as well. And when you think about all of these different components, these frameworks that are coming out, like CAPE and like FIDO too, with the passkeys and phishing resistant MFA. What's nice is all of these systems that our vendors are bringing to market are conforming in a way like Legos, in a sense, where you can plug them together. So you can achieve zero trust not by buying anybody's product explicitly, like the zero trust product, but implementing these concepts of of continual authentication, least privilege, detailed audit, and things of that type, using the framework of zero trust to organize your design and your architecture. So when you pull the marketing out of it, that's really what you're left with, is the common principles and saying, hey, how do we make these things work together and to solve all the problems that we need to? And that's where I think the standards are really, again, coming together to make this something that we can actually make happen.
And especially if we can make happen in that much, but both in the easier sense, it takes us less than 6 months and we don't need to rewrite, as well as the scaling. So we can deal with, rather than just the one app we have, the few hundred. Because, when we talk about authentication, I always, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking of the SSO.tax website, which is where SSO suddenly, these are features, whether it's just SAML, OIDC, what have you, but now this is a premium. It's a great thing to have, but you have to pay more for your enterprise license just to get security. And that seems counterproductive if we look at it from a security industry to say, we know what's a better solution here, but you've got to pay for it to protect your customers, protect your vendors. That just doesn't seem right.
It is kind of a conundrum, right? On one hand, you want to have the highest level security, and it's the app owner and the data person who's responsible for the data who has the most to lose if something goes wrong. But I think it's just maybe commercialism, capitalism that says, hey, we can charge money for it, and if people will pay for it, let's ask to get paid for it. I don't know where I come out on that, to be candid. I think where I like to see things be put more into the hands of individuals, where if I'm going to, for instance, I hate passwords. And if I'm ever given an option to create an account using OIDC and using my Google account, I'm going to do that because it's convenient for me. And it's more secure because now I don't have a password in this new system. And the vendor who has to implement OIDC, maybe they had to spend some extra money in development to support that. But I think that's a pittance compared to the fact that the application and data owner there now says, look, I don't have a password that's going to get compromised.
Right.
I reduced my risk. So, who pays for that? I don't know. I think if at the end of the day, the systems that have the most traction are the ones that do that for free. And so that's why it's Google OIDC versus some commercial OIDC piece. And because it's free. And so I think that would be the future of scale, is where people can decentralize their identity, take more ownership of their own privacy, and then be able to use their identity in a selective way where the user is in control of what data the application provider has access to about me and my personal details. So put the power to the people, and that solves a lot of problems for the app owners and the data custodians, because now it's not their responsibility because it's been pushed to the individual and they don't have to have all that risk.
Indeed. And also, too, you're also shifting to, like the Google OIDC, the password recovery or the account recovery workflows, because those get real tricky. Those can be easy source of insecurity as well as just customer support. So I'm just trying to bolster your case there for people to not stop storing passwords. Maybe store the passkeys, because I lose a public key, that gets exposed. That's nowhere near as impactful. Eric, we don't. You're probably familiar with Endless Summer, but we don't have endless time on our podcast, unfortunately. But people that are interested, what's a good call to action that you want to throw out there for people?
Well, if what I've been describing in identity orchestration resonates with the listeners here today, they can go to our website at strata, strata.io. That's strata.io/podcast. And we have a fun thing. We call it the Identity Orchestration Challenge. And we invite people to submit a use case to say, hey, I don't know, how would you solve this with identity orchestration? And we'll be happy to do a demonstration of how that works and offer some nice Apple EarPods as an incentive to share your story, share your challenge. So we'd love for that to happen. And then if what I've been describing on IDQL and the open source implementation is interesting, you can learn more about that on the Cloud Native Computing Foundation website, the CNCF, and just do a quick search for Hexa, HEXA, policy orchestration, and you can download the source code and start working with it right away.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we neglected to add that into our show notes. We'll make sure to throw those links in there as well. Eric, we also like to have fun here. I apologize, we don't have any AirPods to give away, but we do like to ask our guests to describe application security in 3 words. So I wonder what comes to mind when I say that to you.
Well, I would say 3 words is a tough challenge in a complicated space like this, but zero trust identity.
Identity, very good. I think I was trying to think of a way to pull in Point Break as I get my favorite surfing movie in here. And I won't make you impersonate Keanu's "I am an FBI agent," but I will say thank you very much for joining us, Eric. This was fun.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks again to Eric. Thanks again to John. Thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.